the Chinese did not know very much about Mackinder, I think it's fair to say, until a short time ago. They're now becoming much more aware that these ideas exist in the West. The Russians, of course, have known about Mackinder for a very long time, going all the way back to when his work was published in the early 20th century. And of course, that period of time is actually quite interesting, because the Russians at that time had just completed work on the Trans-Siberian Railway. So you can see the concerns about railways. They were also, at that precise time, occupying northern Manchuria. Their army had advanced into this part of northern China at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. Well, it's not a rebellion, but we'll call it that. The Boxer crisis in China just a few years before. And of course, the British were very alarmed about all of this. And 1904 is an important year also, because this is the year when the Russo-Japanese War begins. And of course, Japan at that time was very much an ally of Britain. And partly, in fact, principally, and I've read an unpublished PhD thesis on this whole issue. Unpublished, I think, for a reason. A lot of the ideas about what caused the Russo-Japanese War are completely wrong. It's widely assumed it was about a conflict over Korea. In fact, the key issue was Manchuria and the Russian presence there. Now, the great irony of it was that the Russians had actually decided to withdraw from Manchuria. They'd made an independent decision, quite unrelated to what the British were concerned about, what the Japanese were concerned about, which was to pull out of Manchuria because they wanted to build better relations with the Chinese government in Beijing. So, it was all, again, another scare about nothing. But it led to the first of a series of wars, which began with the Russo-Japanese War, and then eventually culminated in the First World War and a century of crisis, which in some respects is what we've had over that whole time. And of course, that period of crisis stopped this whole process of Eurasian development. And in 1904, by the way, if you go to Russia at that time, you will find lots of people starting to talk about Eurasianism. The Russian ambassador to Japan, for example, was a major advocate of Eurasianism. Anyway, this whole process was stopped for a whole century. And then, of course, it's now resuming with a vengeance. And just to finish a little bit of this history, if you also read H.G. Wells's book, The War in the Air, which was also published at around this time, a bit later, it's all about ultimately a Chinese-Japanese attempt to conquer the world. And importantly, it's achieved through Japan conquering China and developing Chinese resources in exactly the way that you've described. So you see how all of these imperial fears and fantasies of that period are being resurrected today. In that period, the attempts to prevent them developing led ultimately to a catastrophe from which, in my opinion, Europe has never recovered. The Anglo-Americans did quite well out of it, but Europe itself was devastated and has never regained its pivotal position that it had had up to that time. But now, of course, it's happening all over again in completely different conditions. China is very strong. India is becoming stronger. Russia is recovering, and they're all talking to each other.